Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK week number 9 overview and analysis video. Incredibly excited to get into this. You'll notice there is no power rankings at the end of that statement like there usually is, and that's because this is the final week of LCK action in the regular season. Incredibly exciting stuff. I'm recording this a bit early. This is just as I finished watching these games on Sunday, and so trying to get this out as quickly as possible. As you guys know, if you've watched the channel, there's been a ridiculous amount of content that's had to come out because of playoffs over the past few days. I really do hope you guys are enjoying it. I'm definitely getting my I guess working boots on in terms of watching all these games, trying to get this content out on time for you guys. So if you are enjoying it, again, I don't usually plug stuff at the beginning of videos, but specifically recently, I would really appreciate a like and subscribe. It really does mean a lot to the channel, but I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning. I know that a lot of people don't like to hear that at the beginning, and so let's go ahead and jump right into it. Of course, if you're new here, what we're going to do on the channel is we're going to go game by game, series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'm going to give a player of the series and a dud of the series for all 10 series in the LCK this week, and then at the end of the week, we are going to go ahead and give a light preview of where all these teams are at and just kind of, wrap up the regular season, if you will. Of course, there will be a playoff primer video for the LCK if you want a more in-depth playoff analysis. That's hopefully going to be coming out tomorrow as you guys are watching this. Maybe technically same day today, depending on the hour that you guys end up watching this, because it's like 11 o'clock as I start this recording. It's going to be past midnight as I post this, at least Eastern Standard Time. So without further ado, again, I don't want to waste too much time here at the beginning. Let's go ahead and jump right into the action. Of course, if we're going to go series by series, that means we got to start with day number 1, and day number 1 kicked off with a really fun matchup between T1 and the Kwangdong Freecs, and he's back, baby. The King has returned. The unkillable Demon King has reinserted himself into T1's lineup, and just like that, snap of the fingers, they are back. It really is that simple. It's insane. I really can't tell you how this is happening. I can't tell you why this is happening, but I can tell you that it is happening, that Faker leaves. He has, the injuries, the wrist and arm injuries, and he's taking some time off. Great. I'll obviously put your real life self first. You need to be able to take care of that stuff in order to play at a high level anyways, but this team goes on a massive losing streak. They go 1-7 through 8 series. Faker comes back, and they immediately all look fixed. It's wild how this ends up working. It's almost impossible to say that this is just Faker, but there's so much evidence that says that it's just Faker. I just don't understand how one player can have this much of an impact on the micro and mechanical decisions of a lot of these other players, but everybody did step up for T1. This was the best series that this team has played in a long time, and I'm excited to go over a player of the series for me. You may think it should go to Faker, and again, outstanding circumstances, like, yes, it honestly probably should go to Faker because he returns and all of a sudden everybody starts playing well again after 8 series of them not playing well, but if I'm going purely off of the gameplay that I saw on the Rift, my player of the series is going to go to KIA in the support position. He was really good across this whole series, like the Rakan game in game number 1, but the Alistar in game 2 was so aggressive and it was creating so much. You can argue that obviously, KIA was one of the players that did suffer a lot from Faker being gone, but I don't think he was nearly as bad as people gave him credit for. He was actually pretty good in lane. I think he just struggled outside of lane a little bit more than maybe he had previously, but not nearly to the extent of a player like Owner in the jungle struggling. But KIA I still think was relatively okay. Not nearly as MVP dominant, but this was a great series coming in from him. His mechanics have never really wavered. Like I said, has always been relatively good in lane and has been able to capitalize on a lot of positive situations for the team. It's just been kind of the ancillary stuff that he's been a little bit worse at, but he was really good at that, and I still got to give him a lot of credit for what he was able to create. I think when you're just watching these 2 games, KIA is the player that stands out the most, so he's going to get my player of the series. But again, Faker was really good on the Jace. He took more of a passive role in this game. I expect that to be more common for him now that he's coming back from injury, but I still think he was relatively good. Going into 2 games of Xerath, there's really not a lot that the Jace is going to be able to do to try to punish that too much early, but I think Faker still did a good job of getting out on the map, trying to make it a positive, and his jungler ended up being really positive in this series. Owner actually played super well. Now, Owner is the biggest case, in my opinion, of somebody whose play just drastically decreased when Faker wasn't there. I'm not exactly sure Why that is, I'm not exactly sure if that's, you know, a mental or a micro thing, but even just his jungle pathing, things that I don't imagine Faker really has any sort of control over, was struggling a lot. To me, it's a sign of just a lack of confidence without Faker, or a lack of, you know, a trust in yourself to be able to make those decisions without somebody kind of as a fallback plan, if you will. And I think Owner has definitely been someone who has struggled with confidence before, and so to be able to see him get some confidence back here playing with his really good mid laner, I think is a positive. Zeus was awesome this series, certainly the better top laner out of these two, and he's certainly not going into a scrub in Dudu. And so, you know, and Gumayushi went deathless. So, like, yeah, everybody on T1 looked really good. This was a stomp of a series, 2 23-minute games and 2 easy wins for T1. But then for KDF on the other side, definitely a frustrating loss, I would say, for them. They're still in the playoff race. Like, I know they're technically in last place, or maybe not technically. I think, you know, record-wise, they might not be number 10, but they're pretty darn close, and they're number 10 in my power rankings. And so, yeah, I mean, they're still in the playoff race, even with all of that kind of going against them. The problem is that they're just not very good right now. Basically, all the good things that they were doing this year, you know, through the first half of the summer split, and even like the back half of the spring split, like it's all disappeared. They've become the worst team in the LCK. They have completely forgotten how to generate early leads. They have completely forgotten how to play the mid game, and they just completely fall apart. Basically, every game, no matter what. They got completely outplayed in this one. There was a major mechanical difference in every single lane, and that's frustrating because I do think that there are some good players on KDF. My dud of the series is going to go to Dudu in the top lane. He's been awesome over the course of this year, an all-pro caliber top laner for KDF, but as this team has declined, as they have gotten worse across the map, as the bot lane has continued to be a major problem, and Bulldog and Gen.G have taken major steps back, it feels like Dudu has also started to slowly take some major steps back, and this is his worst series of 2023. I don't even think that's really all that controversial. He's somebody who I do think if you put him in a better environment with better players around him would still be more than fine, but it does kind of feel indicative that Dudu's having a really bad performance when the environment of the rest of the team is really struggling. I don't expect that to change too much. Andal continues to be really bad in the support position. Taiyun was a little bit over-aggressive, but honestly, he really wasn't the biggest problem in the entire world in the series. Bulldog played 2 games of Xerath, and while he was doing a little bit of damage, it certainly wasn't enough to actually make any sort of impact in the game. And Gen.G just got completely out-jungled in both. KDF got run off the map in this series, and this puts them in a really tricky spot. A team that once looked earmarked and destined to take that number 6 playoff spot feels almost completely hopeless at this time. They're now officially 16 games under 500, and that's about the opposite place of where they want to be. And then for T1 on the other side, they look really good here. Obviously, Faker coming back inspires a lot of confidence in fans and the rest of this team, but if they are going to come back and be one of the better teams in the league again like they were before Faker went out, I mean, that's a terrifying team to have to play in the first round, and they're going to be a real threat. And then moving on to our second series of day number 1. And again, every single series this week has major implications, what with so many playoff spots still open and available. And here we had a matchup between Nongshim RedForce and Dplus KIA that DK is going to be able to take 2-0. Good stuff coming in here from DK. Really needed to see them actually step up and play a really good series against a bad team. Although, I will say, game number 2, a little bit reckless, little bit wild. Even game 1 had moments where it was a little bit reckless, a little bit wild. It certainly wasn't the dominating victory that maybe you would have hoped for DK at this point, not only in the split, but just in general, right? Like, being able to take down a team like Nongshim shouldn't really be all that hard for DK, and I think they struggled a little bit more here. Worth noting, Bible is back in. I don't know what they're going to do when it comes to playoff time, whether it's going to be Bible, whether it's going to be Kellen. I think Kellen has made this team better. I think they are better with him. I think Bible, in my opinion, it does make this team a little bit worse and does make them a little bit more flip-floppy, but they've been pretty flip-floppy just in general. I think their core players have been good, but man, they really do need to figure out what they want to do because I actually think it's hurting their performances quite a bit. I think if they had stuck with a group by this point, that they would be in a much better spot in terms of consistency and knowing how to play out some of these late-game situations, but I think the flip-flopping has hurt them a ton. But even saying that, right, like their core members are still playing really well, and a player who has stepped up a ton recently in terms of individual performances has been Kana in the top lane, who is going to get my player of the series here for DK. Almost under the radar how good Kana has been over the past few weeks. I think he has been easily a top 3 top laner over the past 3-ish weeks in the LCK, and that's just a really positive thing I would say overall for Kana. I know a lot of people have been very critical of him, not only just in general, like critical of his performances on this Nongshim Nongshim team last year, and, you know, obviously his time on T1, but people have been very critical of his time on DK and his ability to be a top laner that is worth what Showmaker and Deft and Canyon are able to put out as players. I've never really bought into that. In fact, I've pushed back very heavily on that argument over the course of this year. I've had some long-winded rants in the past, and I think he really is showing that I was kind of right in that situation, that Kana absolutely deserves to be on this team, and that a lot of the other top laners that quote-unquote deserve this spot more than Kana, I just don't think are necessarily in that same conversation for me. So good stuff from Kana. Continues to play really well. I like him on things like the Jax that he can be proactive on in a side lane more so than in the teamfight sense. I think he does well at that part of the game, and I think you've got more than enough stability in the rest of the roster to make that work. But other players that I thought played well, I think Bible actually was relatively good towards the back half. The Leona in game 2 was super important towards the late game teamfights, but again, I think the macro in general really suffers when Kellen is not in the lineup. I've said that before. I will say it again, and I think that was definitely the case here. I thought Deft was pretty solid. Don't necessarily love the draft here in game 2, but I do want to say I love the idea of Ziggs. I've talked about this a ton. I don't think that there nearly are enough teams in the world right now that are going towards AP bot laners with how good AD mid laners are. The Jace, the Tristana, things like that are really rising in popularity, and I think AP bot laners should, you know, rise to complement that. I think there are a lot of opportunities for you to be able to play through a Ziggs. I just don't think Ziggs plus Nico plus Vi is necessarily the game 2 draft that I would personally be looking for. I think you lack a consistent damage source over the back half of the game, but again, the Jax was fed enough, and you had enough CC coming in from the Vi plus the Leona to make it work, and even the Nico, right? But I think if Deft were on like a traditional AD carry in game 2, the game is probably a lot easier to end up ending. Canyon and Showmaker have been a little bit up and down. Showmaker was a little bit hit or miss in this series, but I think he's been awesome over the course of this split. I've said for a while Showmaker's been DK's best player in 2023, and I don't think it's been particularly close. People just forget how good he was over the beginning part of the split. Maybe he hasn't been as dominant over the back half, but he's still been a really good player. And then Canyon on the other side, he's been a little bit more hit or miss. He's definitely been pretty inconsistent, but that's Canyon. He's always been like that in the regular season of the LCK. But for Nongshim on the other side, I do think that there are some positives to take away from this. I think individually speaking, you have some players that have gotten better as of recent. I like Jiwoo. I think he's a pretty solid player, and Peter was actually like spectacular across this entire series. This was the Peter that we kind of saw in 2022 for a Nongshim team that was really struggling when he was getting some time in the spring split for kind of that super team that did end up failing. Maybe not super team, but like a collection of players that they brought in to try and compete, and none of them really worked out together. Peter was getting some time in when effort really was not making it work, and I thought Peter was really good in 2022. This felt a lot more like that than it did the Peter that we had been getting throughout 2023 up until that point. I like Jiwoo and Peter. I think they're a pretty good bot lane, and I think Din has quite frankly just been better over the past couple of weeks than he has at any point in his LCK career. It's good to see growth from a player. I think he was so bad over the beginning part of his career that honestly, like growth, I think getting to a point where he's just kind of getting beaten by Kana and not getting absolutely obliterated, I think is a positive, but I still think there is a lot of work to go, a lot of room to grow for him as a player, and I don't think he's necessarily there yet. Sylvie and Fiesta continue to struggle as a duo. Fiesta in particular, he's going to get my dud of the series here. That Annie game in game number 2, if he was a little bit more explosive, if he was able to do a little bit more in game 2, Nongshim could have very well won that game, but I think Fiesta being, quite frankly, as bad as he was in that game number 2 ended up sealing the fate for Nongshim. This mid lane position has been a black hole for this org all year long, whether it's Fiesta, you know, whether it's, Quad, I couldn't think of his name for a second there, but really no matter who's end up playing here, even Call Me when he was inserted, like it doesn't really matter who has been playing in the mid lane for Nongshim. It's not necessarily worked for this team, and I think that's been a major problem, specifically in the LCK when you've got to go up against Showmaker and Zeka and Faker and Chovy and BDD basically every single game. Like you don't have any easy games in the mid lane in the LCK, and it just doesn't feel like Nongshim's mid lane position has been able to keep up with the rest of the league. But I like the bot lane. Top lane's been getting better, and Sylvie's had okay moments. I think Nongshim definitely is something, and again, they're not officially eliminated from playoffs or anything, but this was a nice win for DK and basically everything you wanted to see from them. They're prepping for a very big encounter in their last series of the year against Hanwha Life, and that's going to be a really fun one to watch, but at the very least, they were able to pick up the W here. And then moving on now to day number 2, and this is really a matchup that's going to determine a lot. One of these teams will technically be eliminated from playoff contention in this matchup. We saw DRX taking on OK BRION, and DRX is going to be able to pick up a very, very big win here. Bro had looked relatively okay for a lot of the middle part of this split when things really started to go south for KDF, and it really was looking like that final playoff spot was really going to be open for business and open for debate. I think a lot of people saw Bro as a pretty big candidate to be the one to take that playoff spot with how they had performed against some good teams and, you know, kind of the effort that they were going on with Karis coming back in and being a lot better, Hanwha taking some steps up. Morgan's always been a relatively good player, but they've just kind of collapsed down the stretch of the season, if we're being entirely honest. Their consistency has completely died. And this series officially ends it for them. With DRX picking up the win, they're going to be sitting at 5 wins. SANDBOX is sitting at 5 wins. And Nongshim is sitting at 5 wins. Bro can no longer get to the mark they need to get to in order to make it into the playoffs, which is unfortunate for them. But congratulations to DRX. They absolutely keep their hopes alive. And honestly, I know we're only 3 games into the week, but when you're talking about easiest paths into the playoffs, DRX has the easiest path into the playoffs of anybody left for that 6th spot. And so really good stuff from them. They needed to win this series, and they did. Really, really big props to them. Player of the series, pretty obviously, to me, is going to go to Beryl in the support position. When the games start to matter, that's when Beryl starts to lock in. He's been so bad over the course of this year, which again, I think a lot of people are going to be very shocked about because of just how good he's been internationally. But go back and watch a lot of the videos that I posted on the LCK in 2022, and you'll see how much I talked about Beryl really struggling last year as well. He was super inconsistent, a major negative for this DRX team over the regular season, and yet everything started to work for them over the back half of the year. Obviously, Zeka really started to turn things on, but Beryl got a lot better as well, and I think him emerging over the back half and sneaking into playoffs, I mean, that's the Beryl thing to do in Summer Split. I wouldn't be all that surprised to see them do it again here, and it's really good to see him playing well on engagers like Rakan, like Alistar. It's really good to see the meta kind of come back around into something that I do think Beryl is very comfortable with. And I do think he's going to be able to play these champions at a high level. That Alistar game in particular, in Game 2, was really solid, but he was just good on the engagers in general throughout both of these games. As for the rest of the team, I actually think everybody else also played really well. DRX honestly was the better team in this series by a pretty large margin. Want to give a big shout to Krako in the jungle. Thought he was really good this series. I'm much higher on him, I think, at this point than a lot of other people. I've been actually pretty complimentary of him over the past, like, week and a half, 2 weeks, somewhere around there. I think ever since he basically, like, regained the starting role for DRX, ever since they tried out Juhan and that wasn't necessarily working, so they went back to Krako, I think he's actually been a pretty good jungler for this team. And so to see him continue to play well and out-jungle MT, that's good. Fate, Paddock, Rascal, they all did really well in this series. DRX honestly just feels like they're peaking at the right time. Still don't truly believe in them as a very good team. They're still crazy inconsistent, and they can lose to anybody. They've proven that very consistently over the course of this year, but when they play well, they actually are a good team. It's just about whether or not that good team is actually going to show up on any given day. And then, like I said, for Bro, an unfortunate way to go out this year. Their season is officially done, alongside the Kwangdong Freecs, who are now officially eliminated as well. And you've got to give a lot of props, I should say, to Bro for trying this split. There were moments where it felt like they had an opportunity to outperform a lot of the expectations that people gave them, outperform, quite frankly, the talent that this team has and the talent that this org has been able to invest in. But unfortunately, it just wasn't going to happen. I think this team is just too inconsistent. And that starts for me with my dead of the series in Umti. I think he's been a lot worse this split than people give him credit for. Again, has had a couple of really good series and a couple of really good games, but when you look at the grand scheme of things, he's had more bad games than good games, and that's definitely something to keep an eye out for. I know a lot of people really like Umti. I know people really like the old Gen Air teams, but I just don't think Umti's very good. I really have a much lower opinion on him as a player than I think a lot of other analysts do at this level, especially fans when you go and look at social media. Really like Umti and really praise Umti. I'm much lower on him as a player and specifically his consistency, and I think that came out here. But Karis also kind of got run over while he was really looking a lot better when he first got called up from Challengers. The last week or so had been really bad for Karis, and you know, I think he's kind of reverted back into the form that he had at the beginning of this split and at the beginning of this year, which is definitely unfortunate. He's always had upside, but he's never really been able to consistently hit it. Hanwha has just kind of been an okay AD carry, certainly not anyone that's going to change the game. Morgan, I think, is a good top laner, not a great top laner on a bad team, which means he's going to look like a bad top laner here in the LCK. And effort's been really bad over the course of the last couple weeks, but he really wasn't that big of a mistake. Like, he really hasn't been awful for Bro. He was worse for Nongshim last year by a considerable margin. As much as I'm still super out on effort because I truly don't understand how he continuously keeps getting starting spots in the LCK. I think there are, like, theoretically worse options you could go for here in the support position. But for Bro, like I said, your playoff hopes are done. Your season is not done. You've still got one more series. But for DRX, your playoff hopes are absolutely still alive with this win. And you arguably have the easiest path to get there as long as you can take out arguably the worst team in the LCK right now. Later on in the week, you're going to be able to get into those playoff spots more than likely. And that's a situation, I think, if you would have told DRX fans that they would be making playoffs basically at any point since the start of the year, they would have called you crazy, but they would have been so incredibly happy. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2 here, and this is a good one. It's a battle between two of arguably the top 3 teams in the LCK right now. We saw Hanwha Life Esports taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G is going to be able to pick up the win. They still only have the 1 loss on the year so far, in the regular season, I should say, to KT Rolster very recently, but outside of that, they've been basically untouchable, and they continue to be a major threat here in the LCK. I think a lot of people have started to write off Gen.G, started talking about this a bit last week. It feels like this team has lost a lot of the public steam that they were able to generate, not only by winning the LCK, but by coming back into the LCK and probably being the best team through the first couple of weeks. Now that KT has really emerged as probably the best team, I think people have written off Gen.G and just said, like, it's KT's league to lose. And while maybe that's true, like maybe KT is just better than Gen.G, I don't really believe it's by that much, right? Like, I don't think it's, you know, it's impossible for me to imagine a world where Gen.G continues to run the way that they're currently running and just wins the LCK again in pretty dominant fashion, just like they did in spring when they were not favorites going into finals anyways. And so I still like this Gen.G team a lot. 16-1 is a really hard record to beat. And man, the talent on this team is ridiculous. Player of the series was near impossible because all 5 members played out of their minds. Quite frankly, they all gapped their opponents, and their opponents are not slouches. I think a lot of people are going to give this to Doran. He really beat up Kingen in lane. That was a really rough Aatrox game 2 from Kingen, and Doran was a big reason for that, especially on that Jax, like I said, in game 2. Peanut mega gapped Grizzly. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but Peanut has been phenomenal over the course of this year. Paze and Delight have been the best bot lane in the LCK, and Paze is very likely going to win the MVP. In this series, he set the kill record for the LCK regular season, surpassing the person that he replaced on this team in Ruler. But my player of the series is going to go to Chovy in the mid lane. Ridiculous how good Chovy is. And I know his scoreline isn't quite as flashy as maybe some of the other players on this team, but his game 1 on the Tristana was probably the best individual game of this series, and I think that's really what I took into account when I was thinking of player of the series. If you want to give it to Paze for that Kai'Sa game in particular in game 2, go ahead. If you want to give it to Peanut for gapping Grizzly in terms of jungle pressure, go ahead. Like, all of these things are absolutely right, but Chovy to me was sensational, and he's been sensational all year long. I know that there are a lot of flashy names that we can talk about over or underperforming, but when we talk about Peanut and Chovy, like, these guys have been the best players in their roles for years now, and they continue to be that. They're not underperforming. The fact that I'm not bringing them up in every single conversation does not mean they're underperforming. The only reason that they're almost flying under the radar, if you will, is because it's just so socially acceptable to consider them the best players in their position at this point, and it continues to be the case. Chovy was ridiculous going into a player in Zeka who did step up, was easily the best player on the side of Hanwha Life. Peanut was phenomenal. Paze was really good. Like I said, Doran's probably been the best top laner in the LCK over the back half of the split. Everything is working right now for Gen.G, and this idea that they're not on the same level as KT Rolster is not something that I necessarily subscribe to at the moment. But for Hanwha Life on the other side, they had been mega hot going into this series, and so to see them kind of get bounced by Gen.G, it's not particularly surprising because, again, top 2 in the LCK do feel rather solidified, but, you know, Hanwha was one of the teams that we were looking at potentially being able to break their way into that top 2. I think a lot of the optimism surrounding that ideology was maybe dashed a little bit. In this series, I don't necessarily think it would be impossible for Hanwha to figure something out and be able to get back on track, but this series was not a good indicator that they've got that available and ready to go. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Grizzly in the jungle. He was the most noticeably just outclassed in his individual role. We've been really praising Grizzly on this channel over the past few weeks, and I think he's absolutely earned it. Going up against some of the more inconsistent junglers, it really does show how aggressive Grizzly can be and how consistently he is able to generate leads in the early game and translate that into success. But what Grizzly has really been great at is team fighting, which I don't think a lot of junglers, especially in this region, are really like known for. Peanut is one of the few junglers that I would kind of consider known for his late game team fighting and his ability to kind of play that part of the game, but jungle as a position, especially in the last few years, has really incentivized being able to generate early leads rather than being more consistent as a carry towards the back half of the game. But I think Grizzly has been very good doing both, mostly as a carry, but the problem is going into Peanut, he just lost too much tempo in the early game, and this was a concern going into the best teams in the entire world, and that was unfortunately something that did play out. If Grizzly's going to continue to be able to grow and maybe get to the point where he can handle matchups like this a little bit better, that's going to be really good for him, but for now, you know, some concerns. I do think the rest of this team also underperformed. Kingen got obliterated in game number 2 on that Aatrox. That signature pick of his that he's got a skin for didn't necessarily look all that good. Zeka and Viper had moments, but Viper in particular I thought was relatively outclassed by his opposition in Pays in this series, which is really good to see if you're a Pays fan, but really not good to see if you're a Viper fan, because you really need him to step up and be like the number 180 carry. Life was meh. Zeka had okay moments, especially on the Azir, but really there just wasn't a lot Hanwha Life could do. Gen.G was just straight up better in this series, and you've got to be able to live with that. Hopefully Hanwha can keep growing. Hopefully Grizzly in particular can keep growing, and they can get to the point that maybe when they face off in the playoffs, maybe they have an option or an opportunity to be able to win this series, but for now, not something that I was particularly impressed with. And then for Gen.G, they're still fantastic. Don't underestimate this team just because KT has been so good. This is absolutely still a team that can end up taking the LCK crown and heading to Worlds as the number 1 seed out of the LCK. Then moving on now to day number 3, our middle series here, our middle day of the week, if you will. And again, a very important matchup here between Liiv SANDBOX and T1. It's T1's final series of the regular season, and they are able to grab the dub. Big stuff coming in from T1. Again, the whole team just feels so revitalized with Faker back into the lineup. It's actually absurd how different the game is with Faker in than with Faker not in. It feels like a completely different game for so many of these players. It genuinely feels like you're going from being, you know, KT or Gen.G to being, you know, KDF, right? Like, that's the difference in just bringing Faker back into this lineup. And again, I don't know what kind of voodoo magic Faker ends up working. I don't know what kind of deal with the devil or Riot or whoever he made any sort of blood sacrifice to that gave him these kinds of powers to completely change everything that's going on in his team. But whatever he did, it's absolutely working for T1, and they're back on track. I'm not going to say that they're a team that could absolutely win the LCK, but like, how far away really are they from being a team that could compete to win the LCK? They were in finals last split, and they did well at MSI. They were the best performing LCK team at MSI. Who's to say they can't be the best team in the LCK with everything clicking? It's insane, the turnaround. But again, the thing that really surprises me is, as good as Faker is, it's not Faker that's turning around his game. It's everybody else that has really stepped up as Faker has come back into the lineup. Faker's not carrying these games as much as you can talk about the macro. He's not microing these mechanical decisions, and I think the confidence that he just instills in all of the players around him completely changes the perception of the game. Player of the series for me is going to go to Zeus in the top lane. Phenomenal series coming in from him. A classic performance on the Maokai in game number 2. We're really not seeing a lot of solo lane Maokai in 2023. It's not been a very popular thing to take. We've seen Maokai in the jungle, obviously, that's his big role, but we've seen a bit of Maokai support as well. It's definitely been relatively popular, but Maokai was created to be a top laner, and I do think that obviously he's a lot stronger in that role than people are giving him credit for. He's certainly stronger than no picks in any major region before this, so Zeus pulling him out and being as dominant as he was in game 2 was great, and then add that onto the fact that he was by far the most influential player in game number 1 on that Cassante. Just really good stuff overall coming in from Zeus. But I think Owner also played pretty fantastic. Going deathless in a series on Maokai and Lee Sin is not particularly easy. You're going to be putting yourself in the line of fire in a lot of different situations and scenarios, and he still did play very aggressive. Owner is the player that has looked by far the most different since Faker has come back in. Again, I don't really know what Faker does to Owner, but when Faker is out of the lineup, Owner legit looks like a bottom 3 jungler in the LCK, and when Faker is in the lineup, Owner looks like the best jungler in the LCK. I don't really know what happens, but Owner is the player that I think is the most noticeable in terms of difference between with Faker and without Faker. And Owner had a great series here. KIA continues to be great. Gumayushi was great kind of the whole time. He was the one player that didn't really feel like he was super affected by Faker not necessarily being in the lineup. But Guma now has a lot more opportunities to carry games and to be this major damage threat towards the back half because the rest of his team isn't completely inting the game away. And so for T1, they just continue to look really good. And for SANDBOX, this is not a very good loss. This was your easiest game left on the schedule. This was basically a must-win for you. You needed to put yourself in a position where you could actually take this game and, take this series and at least show some level of fight, and you just weren't able to do that. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Clear in the top lane. He's probably been the best player ever since he was inserted into the lineup over Bertle on this SANDBOX team. You've had moments where Closer has looked okay, and Willer and Teddy and Kale, I think, have been bad basically the whole split, but Clear, I think, had moments where he had been pretty solid, but not in this series. He got whatever voodoo magic Faker has, he fell under it. Clearly, he was not prepared to go into Faker because he got hit with the mind control, the consistently taking Jax and diving onto the Xerath to try to kill him in every single opportunity and basically giving up the entire game for it. Again, the classic Faker for Nexus trade that basically every team gets mind controlled into doing in 2023. I still don't know how he keeps getting away with this, but it happens every single time, and it's never punished, so again, I guess good stuff for Faker, but bad stuff for SANDBOX and Clear. I think in general had a pretty bad series overall for them, but the rest of the team also couldn't quite keep up. I thought Teddy was entirely useless in this series, and again, I know a lot of people out there defend Teddy to the death, saying that he's elo held on this team. I don't think Teddy has particularly played well over the course of this year. I don't think he's been like a disaster in the same way that Willer or Kale have, or Closer for some of these games have. But I don't think Teddy's been good. Like, I certainly don't think that he has been someone that I would expect to be on a top 6 team in terms of just his performance alone. And so I don't know, maybe I'm just not seeing it, but he's just kind of been a guy on this team, and that's not necessarily good on a team that's bad. Kale has been pretty bad for this team, some major steps back this split. Willer lost a lot of pressure in this series, even though he wasn't a major problem, and Closer just in general is very inconsistent. When he has to play from behind, he's just not a very good mid laner, and that just is what it is, right? He's a very streaky player, and he loves being able to play with tempo, and when the team doesn't have nearly as much tempo, he is going to struggle a lot more. We not only saw that this year, we've seen it in previous years for Closer. That's just who he is as a player. Going into a player in Faker who used to be a mentor figure for him on T1 when he was in their system. And so for SANDBOX, they're just not very good. Like, I wanted this team to be the one that ended up making the top 6 because I did think that last week they showed the most of any of the bottom tier teams, but with DRX kind of surging right now, like, I don't know, SANDBOX has a much more difficult path into getting into playoffs. It's technically not impossible for them, but it's certainly not going to be easy, and some things are very much going to have to go right against one of the best teams in the league. But for T1, they've somehow gotten their way back up to 500. They're sitting at 9-9. They will finish the year at 500, which, with how they had looked throughout a lot of the back half of the split, that's a miracle. That's a miracle for T1. But with Faker back in, they could do a lot better than this. They're going to be the 5 seed heading into playoffs, and I'm pretty sure nobody really wants to get that 4 seed because I don't think anybody wants to play them in round 1. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3 here, and again, it's a super important one because we really are down to the nitty-gritty. It's a matchup between Nongshim RedForce and KT Rolster that KT is going to be able to take, not in a 2-0, but in a 2-1 series win. Nongshim able to take a game, and they really showed up. They tried their best in this series to keep their playoff hopes in good spirits, but man, it's just a tough draw here to have your final week be going up against KT Rolster, your final series to be going up against KT Rolster, and unfortunately, they just didn't have the firepower to be able to come out on top in this series. There was definitely an opportunity potentially for them to be able to keep their playoff hopes alive if they somehow were able to take down KT, and they did look really good in game number 1 when they were able to win, but unfortunately, this loss puts them in an unenviable position. I believe this does officially eliminate them from playoff contention because I believe SANDBOX will always make it over them at this point. I could be wrong. I think that's how this goes, unless SANDBOX gets destroyed or something like that. I think Nongshim is officially eliminated from playoff contention with this loss, which is unfortunate. But again, congratulations to KT. They're working on the 17-1 regular season record. They're working on getting that number 1 seed. And, I think in a lot of cases, like they would feel like they could potentially take their foot off the gas around this time at 15-1. Like, how much do you really have left to play for? But actually, they do have quite a bit to play for. That number 1 seed is very important in the playoffs for this team, and Gen.G is right there with them at 16-1. So they really do have to keep trying in these games, whether they like to or not, although luckily I don't think it's going to matter too much for them because they're just a really good team. Player of the series for me in this one is going to go to Keen in the top lane. He's so good. He's the most talented top laner in the LCK, in my opinion. You can argue who's having a better split between him and Doran. I think it's a very close argument. I think Keen arguably means more to his team, but I think when you look at individual performances, especially over the back half of the split, I think you could argue that Doran has been given more tools to be able to succeed, and so it's a really interesting argument. Both of them have been incredible, and in my opinion, both of them are having fantastic splits. We really haven't seen top laners in the LCK in particular really, like, explode. Like, Zeus did it a little bit last year, but really he wasn't doing it, like, all the time. He was just playing on a really good team that was also really good, right? But I think Keen and Doran are really exploding this year, and it's been a lot of fun to watch in the top lane. Keen was awesome specifically on that Fiora in game number 2. They don't win without that Fiora in game number 2, and the Malphite obviously meaned a lot in game number 3, but I do think that he's getting the player of the series for that Fiora game. Want to give a big shout out to Aiming as well. He's been so much more a part of the game plan in the second half of the split for KT than he really was at any point in 2023 at all. Aiming is the player on this team that I think a lot of people really needed to see step up, not only in like a series like this, but just in general, like going into the year. Aiming was a little bit of a question mark, not because he played poorly in 2022, because he absolutely did not. 2022 was a big breakout year, but exactly because of that, it was kind of a breakout year for Aiming. He really had not been that consistent of a carry at any point in his career up until that point, and so really good to see him continue that fantastic momentum that he was able to generate last year. He was by far the better ADC in this series. BDD's Azir looked phenomenal in game number 1, but, you know, again, shout out to Fiesta on the Seraphine, actually did a really good job of shutting him down. Cuz was really consistent on the Viego on the back half. Lehens is just a fantastic player, an MVP candidate, probably will be an MVP finalist for me, and KT, I think in general, was just awesome in this series. And then for Nongshim on the other side, like I said, you definitely had an opportunity here to keep your playoff hopes alive, but it's KT Rolster. You really couldn't have expected yourself to come out and dominate this team. I do think you put up a relatively good effort. Being able to take a game off of KT is not easy. They've really not lost that many games over the course of this year up until this point. So to see Nongshim be able to take it, you've just got to give them a lot of props for that. I do think a couple of these players did play well. Most notably, I think Peter in the support position had a great series, especially on the Rakan. I think the first 2 games were really positive for this team overall. I think Fiesta looked really good in game 1 on the Seraphine. Crazy to see Seraphine mid get pulled out here in the LCK in basically a do or die situation for a team, but that kind of innovation definitely mattered, and the Seraphine had to be banned out basically the rest of the series, which is huge. But at the end of the day, they just didn't have enough firepower, and one player in particular I think really did struggle down the stretch, and that was unfortunately Jiwoo in the AD carry role. He's going to get my dud of the series. Jiwoo has been awesome for Nongshim, probably the best player on this team ever since he got inserted into the lineup over Vital. Unfortunately, it just wasn't enough in this series. Jiwoo was really struggling, especially towards the back half. There was a lot of potential gold on the table for Nongshim in game number 3, but basically all of it went over to the Ahri, which meant that the Zeri ended up not really having a lot of impact towards the back half of this game, and I think that really hurt Jiwoo, consistently dying in a lot of team fights, consistently getting dove on by, like, the Malphite and the Viego and the Nico and the Nautilus and the Tristana. Like, look at that comp in game 3. It's very difficult for the Zeri to play into it, especially if she doesn't have enough gold to be able to deal a consistent amount of damage very quickly, which she did not, and so poor Jiwoo just kind of struggled down the stretch, but it is what it is. I thought Sylvie, Fiesta, Peter actually did play relatively well this series, and Nongshim certainly has nothing to hang their head about. I think they outperformed expectations this year. This was an entirely rookie team coming in, and while I was a big fan of these players in the Challengers League, and I did think they would be around the 8th best team in the LCK, I really do think that they've, overperformed what I expected. Their macro's gotten better. The individual performances are there. I think if they had a better mid laner for a lot of this year, things may have gone a little bit differently, quite frankly. I like some of the progress that they made, but gonna be interesting to see what this org does and where some of these players go, but it does seem to be that their split is over here. But for KT Rolster, nice win. Again, you're really playing for that number 1 seed now, and this win obviously matters. It's going to be up to both you and Gen.G down the stretch of this week to see who ends up getting it, but KT has put themselves in the best position possible in order to secure it. And moving on now to our first series of day number 4 here, and this is one that I think a lot of people were really looking forward to. And man, I've got a lot to say about this because I think some of the takeaways are right, and a lot of the takeaways are wrong. Again, you know, Kyle in an LCK video being mad at Reddit. What else is new? Let's go ahead and talk about it. It's Dplus KIA taking on Hanwha Life Esports, and Hanwha Life is able to pick up a dominant 2-0 win. They were the better team here by far, and I think they've proven in this series that they are the better team out of these two, that Hanwha Life is really just streaking at the right time, that in particular Grizzly and Zeka are really on the same page, and Kingen I think has been playing really well in that same vein. Life I think has come back around, and Viper's really good at League of Legends. He's somehow not even the focal point of this team. He's more of an ancillary piece on them right now, and that should go to show you just how good Hanwha Life is. I am going to prep you guys for the Reddit rant. I feel like I have to do one of these in every single LCK video because the LCK Reddit can sometimes just be wrong, and you know, we'll go over it in a second, but let's talk about Hanwha Life first and foremost, because it doesn't really have anything to do with Hanwha Life. I am super high on this team now. They have convinced me. They have locked me in. I have watched the tape, and there's no denying it anymore. Every single piece on this team is clicking. Everything seems to be working. Player of the series for me is going to go to Zeka in the mid lane. I very narrowly gave this to Grizzly in the jungle. Both of them played phenomenal, but it's their duo together that really does excite me a lot. I actually get super reminded of Pioshik and Zeka when things really work out for this team. Zeka was so dominant in lane phase the entirety of this series, specifically on the Jace in game 2, but still, even on the Ahri in game number 1, it felt like he was consistently exerting so much control on the map and doing so much during the game that it was so difficult for DK to actually try to get back into it because their mid games were constantly tormented by shock blasts or by, you know, Ahri charms or just by raw damage and raw pressure coming out from Zeka. So really good stuff. But I do think there would have been avenues back into the game if it weren't for Grizzly, who I do think was also really good for this Hanwha Life team. And again, with those two on the same page, both of them stepping up, getting more comfortable playing with each other, getting, you know, kind of right in terms of how they want to find their game plan, that's super dangerous. And Zeka is notable for stepping up his performances and his games when it matters the most and as we get closer to international tournaments. And so this is a big plus for Hanwha Life. They continue to be great. Viper and Life were really solid. Life in particular I thought was really good this series. The engages, especially coming in on the Alistair in game 1, were really nice. Kingen continues to be solid. He actually was really good into Kana. Kana was also really good in that top lane matchup, but I don't think that's taking anything away from Kingen, and Viper obviously was incredibly solid, was consistent in terms of the damage he was able to output, even if he wasn't getting a ton of attention from his own team. A lot of that was going mid lane, and I do think that's the right choice. If you're going to play towards a player, I suggest it to be Zeka in this kind of makeup of the team. I think Grizzly and Zeka have a great synergy together, and I think Zeka does really well with those resources, and Viper's really good at being a late game carry, even without resources. This Hanwha Life team has very much figured out their style, and I think everything's really clicking for them. But here's the part where I'm, you know, gonna rant a little bit. The DK rant, and I don't mean to, I want to preface this again, first of all, by saying that I've talked about this on the channel before. I think I said very similar things last week, but I'm continuing to see so much talk about it that I feel like it's worth addressing. Like, maybe fans of the channel aren't thinking this, but in case they are, I do very much want to make this worth addressing because I understand that a big part of the audience for these videos is people who don't watch the games, people who don't watch the LCK all that regularly. And so I do want to make it abundantly clear when you know, see the post-game threads about, oh, Canyon and Showmaker have never been this bad, or oh, Canyon and Showmaker are look like they're completely burnt out, and it looks like they're heading towards breaking up, and, you know, we've never seen these two players be such hindrances before. I want to be as clear as I can possibly be when I say that time is a flat circle, and every narrative in the LCK is continuously repeated, and yet people never ever learn. This is 2022 and 2019 all over again for DK. It's almost the exact same script, where both of them were really solid at the beginning of the split. One of them was actually exceptionally solid and exceptionally good for the team. Last year it was Canyon, this year it's Showmaker, where both of them aren't going to get credit for being as good as they were through the first half of the regular season, but both of their performances start to downturn towards the back half, and they go into the playoffs with major question marks. Remember, in 2022, they were out in the first round of the playoffs. People don't remember that because the team did end up going on to Worlds, and Canyon had a ridiculous performance at that tournament, but I don't know if they're still up. If they are, go find the post-match threads for every regular season game down the stretch for DK, over the course of 2022 in summer, and all you're gonna see is people saying Canyon's so washed, awful player, nobody's any good, and he's never gonna make it to Worlds playing like this. And then obviously he turned it around because he's Canyon, and that's what he does. But again, the same thing is happening again this year. I feel like I'm in some sort of Groundhog Day scenario where everybody has just simply forgotten that this is what Canyon and Showmaker do. They struggle down the stretch of regular seasons because they stop caring. They stop investing a ton into regular season games. I'm not trying to sit here and say that they didn't play bad. Showmaker was bad this series. He's going to get dead of the series. Canyon was also out-jungled completely by Grizzly. But this idea that I've seen the idea perpetuated that this is the last year that Canyon and Showmaker are going to play together. Clearly, they're washed together. They're never going to make it work. I would be very surprised if they don't pick up their pace at least a little bit in playoffs, but even more specifically, you know what's really likely to happen? And you can pinpoint this, hopefully. I don't know if you can clip on YouTube. I don't know how this shit works, but if this does end up becoming true, then this is going to be a short at some point. But like, if Canyon and Showmaker end up turning it on and getting to Worlds and getting out of groups, and Canyon has a really good Worlds tournament or Showmaker has a really good Worlds tournament, I'm going to clip this and say, you're not allowed to be surprised. You're not allowed to sit there after and say, like, who was ever doubting Canyon? Who was ever doubting Showmaker in your stupid little post-match Reddit threads? Because you were the ones doubting Canyon and Showmaker. It was you. And so, I don't know, man. Yes, are they playing poorly right now? Absolutely. But do I think that they're going to get better like they do every single year in the playoffs? Yes, I do think so. They always step it up when it matters the most. I don't know if it's going to happen in the playoffs, but if this team goes to Worlds, you can bet your ass that they're going to be dangerous at the World Championships. They just need to get there. But outside of that, Deft and Kana were awesome this series. So sorry for the little bit rant. I just want to make it clear that this idea that DK has never looked like this before, this is the shakiest they've ever looked, it's just a fallacy. This is what this org does super consistently. And again, I understand people know DK internationally and not necessarily domestically nearly as much, but I'm here to tell those people who aren't as familiar with DK domestically, they do this every single year. So don't worry too much. If they fail out of the regional qualifier and don't go to Worlds, that's when you can start worrying. But for now, I would say they're exactly what I expected them to be, and Hanwha Life is better than I expected them to be. That's going to continue to be the narrative that I'm going to pitch. Deft and Kana are playing well. Zeka and Grizzly are playing great. And Viper and Life feel like they've gotten on the same page. Kingan's ramping up. Everything for Hanwha is working. Irregardless of what DK is doing, Hanwha is a very good team. Maybe not top 2 worthy, as we saw earlier in the week, but still a team that you absolutely have to look out for. And then moving on to the second series of day number 4 here, and this was the upset of the week by far. We had OK BRION taking on Gen.G, and somehow, someway, BRION's able to take this series 2-0. I don't really know how we ended up in this circumstance, but it feels like we continuously end up in circumstances like this with Bro every single split. The moment that they are officially eliminated from the season, it becomes all-out chaos for them. They're so much better with no stakes than they are with stakes that it's actually astounding. But Bro able to throw a massive wrench into this plan for, basically Gen.G and for their attempt to try to get that #1 seed. Things had to go their way for them to be able to get that #1 seed, because while they were at 16-1 going into this series, even if they were to win 2-0, KT Rolster would need to drop a game later in the week for them to get it. But this all but ends any sort of bid for any ability for Gen.G to get that #1 seed. In fact, I do believe this ends their opportunity to get that #1 seed, because if KT loses 0-2 as well, I do believe that they still have the better record to be able to get that #1 seed. But Bro, what a series coming in from them. Talked about some of these players that had really kind of cooled off in the recent weeks, as they had been pretty good towards the middle of the split, but this was kind of a resurgence towards that part. Solo laners in particular, they're the 2 standout members of this team in terms of what they've been able to do in their wins, and I think that continued in this series, in my opinion. My player of the series is going to go to Karis in the mid lane. Man, when he plays well, he plays really well. It's just been consistency for him. There have been moments, like I said, towards the middle of that split where he's stepped up and really shown that he's been able to grow and get better, but it's not been consistent enough. He had a lot of bad games leading up to this one, and so, it's hard to kind of determine and disseminate, like, how I feel about Karis as a player, but I think in general, there have been good moments in the LCK, and I liked him a lot in the Challengers League, like 2 years ago now, and so, it's an interesting kind of conversation to have, but he honestly just kind of outplayed Chovy in this series, which is certainly not something I expected. He got 2 of the power picks in the meta, but they just swapped picks. They just traded picks. The Tristana in Game 1, the Jace in Game 2 were both fantastic. I think Karis was a little bit more dominant on that Tristana in particular in that first game, but the Jace game was also really good, and he went deathless across this entire series. Again, just really impressive stuff coming out from a player that I don't think a lot of people thought was going to be all that competitive in this series. And then Morgan is the other player you really have to shout out. Doran's been so phenomenal. Like I said, has really been like 1A, 1B with Keen for best top laner in the LCK over the course of this year, and Morgan just kind of dominated him in this series. Got his signature Renekton pick, something that I think a lot of people really closely associate with him as a player, and man, did he show up and show out on that pick. He was so good in this series. Was really solid on 2 AP junglers to try and complement the fact that they were going Tristana and going Jace. The Kog'Maw picked up by Henna in game number 2. We've been seeing this pick grow in popularity as kind of a pseudo Kai'Sa, if you will. We've even seen it paired up with Kai'Sa in the mid lane, so a couple of interesting things there, but Kog'Maw does so much damage if you can get him to the point of the game where he can deal all that damage, so good stuff there. Effort was really good at protecting, especially on that Braum in Game 2, where all he needed to do was make sure that the Jace and the Kog and the Renekton had the opportunity to end up carrying the game, and I just think everybody did their part on Bro, and this was just a really good series for them overall and a crazy way for them to end 2023. But for Gen.G, this is about as disastrous as you could have possibly asked for. I mean, obviously, a lot would have had to go right for them to get that number 1 seed, but this completely takes it out of their hands. They're now locked in at that number 2 seed, which is significantly worse because at the very least, one really good team is probably going to come through round 1, and so not having the ability to select your side there, I think, is definitely unfortunate, but they did it to themselves. They lost the series. They honestly just kind of got outplayed. A lot of their really good players ended up underperforming quite a bit. I think Chovy and Paze had moments where they looked good. Chovy in particular was able to do a bit in Game 2 on the Tristana because that champion is just really good if you're a good player, and Paze tried his best on the Kai'Sa to be relevant, but everybody else really suffered, specifically, in my opinion, Doran in the top lane, who, like I said, just kind of got outplayed by Morgan. They were more than happy to give him his more signature Renekton pick and kind of just let the game happen and see where it goes, and I think that did end up coming back to bite them, and I don't think Doran was really ready to be able to kind of go up against Morgan in that environment. He really struggled, which is not something I expected going into this series. Delight, I think, really struggled trying to find good engages on the Nautilus. Most of the time, he was being used as peel because you're looking at the rest of this comp and you just see a lot of damage. You don't really see a lot of ways for them to be able to consistently set up that damage, and I think that did end up being a problem for this team. You were really hoping, I think, that the Skarner turned into that in game number 2, but Peanut really wasn't all that active, and there really wasn't all that much that the Skarner could do in game 2, specifically when the Lilia got super far ahead and when you had to deal with the Kog'Maw. There really is no easy target to end up ulting and bringing back in unless you can somehow get on that backline, which is just so much more difficult than it sounds. And so Delight and Doran kind of struggling, but Gen.G did get outplayed. This really wasn't like one, individual player losing. They kind of lost around the map, and because of that, both games were pretty bro favored, which is wild. I'm sorry to Gen.G. They're not going to be going into playoffs with the most amount of confidence that they have, but they are going to end their regular season at 16-2, and so I doubt they're going to be too frustrated with a loss like this. But for Bro on the other side, like I said, it just goes to show you the power of the organization, the memes, the weird aura that kind of surrounds this team. It absolutely continues to permeate, and, ending your season off with a win over Gen.G has to feel pretty good. Obviously, they have no opportunity to make playoffs, but to be able to pick up a win over one of the best teams in the entire world, that's got to make you feel pretty darn good. And then moving on to our final day of the week and our final day of the regular season, and we kicked it off with a super important matchup between DRX and the Kwangdong Freecs. And DRX is able to pick up a monumental victory here. They're going to get to 6 wins, and unless there's a major upset later today, they will be the only team in the bottom that ends up getting to 6 wins, which would put them in that playoff spot as the number 6 seed, which looked completely improbable for DRX. Obviously, things aren't done yet, but a pretty major upset would have to happen later in the day with KT Rolster and Liiv SANDBOX in order to get DRX out of that spot. So congratulations to this team for even putting themselves in a position to potentially get into the playoffs in the first place. Unbelievable resilience from some of these players who have just been beaten down and down and down and down over the course of this year. Nothing has gone right for this org except for right now. All the chips have fallen into place for them to potentially be able to pick up that final playoff spot. Funny enough, they really benefited the most from T1 struggling as much as they did. They were able to pick up 2 of their 6 series wins over the course of this year on T1, both without Faker. So wild stuff from DRX, but I guess sometimes you get lucky in terms of schedule outcomes. Not everybody else is going to get that same kind of luck, but congratulations to this DRX team for now, for at least putting themselves in that position. Player of the series for me is going to go to Krako in the jungle. Wow, Krako has really stepped it up recently. Like, this is the Krako I think we were all kind of expecting to see on DRX. He had been so good for Sandbox, not only last year, but people have to remember in 2021 as well. I know last year obviously was a pretty good year for Sandbox that just ended with them barely not making Worlds. Prince and Kale, I think, were the big kind of standouts of that team, but I think Krako was part of that big 3, in my opinion, and really they were the 3 that were driving that team forward. But because of that, I think people forget just how good Krako was in 2021 when he won Rookie of the Year in the LCK over Owner, which was a very big deal at the time, but he earned it, right? Krako's been a really good player before. It's not just, one-year wonder for Krako. He was looked at as a very consistent jungler and someone who was going to raise the floor of basically every team he played for. That had not been the case for DRX. He was miserable over the beginning part of the year, and even in Summer Split, like, he was not very good for this team, but did get replaced by Juhan. Eventually, Juhan was struggling enough where Krako came back in, and Krako's been awesome ever since he got back in. Maybe not awesome, maybe that's too strong, but he's been a good LCK jungler. Like, he's not been getting destroyed in the early game. He's been a very solid team fighter. He's very good on these engage threats, and oh man, that Lee Sin kick in game number 2. That was one of the spiciest things that I've seen in a while. It really does feel like we're getting, the Krako that we all know back. And I hate to say it, but it kind of feels like Pioshik magic here on DRX, where he gets benched, comes back in, gets to play some of the champions that he's a lot more comfortable on, and all of a sudden starts doing well again. The Zac in game number 1 is super wild, and you love to see that, but just in general, I think Krako's actually been super good. The rest of this team obviously stepped up. Fate went 13-1 and 14 in this series. I think that scoreline's a little bit inflated from some of the plays made by Krako and Beryl, who I think were the 2 best players on this team, but still a great scoreline. Same thing for Paddock, only dying once, but like I said, Krako and Beryl, in my opinion, were the big standout threats on DRX, and honestly, Beryl had a phenomenal week. He's going to be in contention for Player of the Week, which is wild considering it's Beryl, but, Genshin update comes out and all of a sudden Beryl starts doing well again. Coincidence? I think not. Anyways, Krako and Beryl were both really good across this whole week and a big reason why DRX went 2-0 in the final week of the season. Rascal was solid on the top side going into a good top laner. Like I said, Fate and Paddock were solid. This was just a good game from DRX. Really not a lot of notes to give them here. And then for KDF, it's just disaster for this team. Everything has completely folded for them. At one point, it looked almost unanimous that they were going to be able to get that 6th and final playoff spot. They were actually playing really well. They were about 500 through the first couple weeks of the season. We had seen consistent growth from a lot of these players, and players like Dudu and Bulldog were really starting to find their own, pathing, find their own footing, really become the stars that they can be. And then from there, I mean, it just gets so messy. It gets so destroyed, and now they're going to end the LCK regular season alone in 10th place, which is insane. They're the only team at 4-14, which is wild to say, but it's just crazy how far KDF has fallen, quite frankly. A lot of these players do still have a lot of upside, but man, I don't know what happened internally to get them to this point. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Youngjae. Already talked about how good Krako was. A lot of that was Youngjae losing a lot of pressure in the early game and not really being able to catch up at all. I don't think anybody else on this team played well. This is the worst bot lane in the LCK by a ginormous margin. They just do not know how to survive, really, under any circumstance. Taiyun and Andil, Taiyun and June, no combination that they played over the course of this split was serviceable enough to be able to let anybody else on this team win. And the problem with that is that I think everybody else on this team regressed. Like I said, the solo laners were really starting to find themselves, come into their own. Dudu in particular, I think, was really becoming one of the best top laners in the LCK. And all of that has fallen apart. I still think Dudu's the best player on this team. I think that was proven very clearly in this series in particular. But outside of that, Like, Bulldog, major regression after a pretty good spring split that did kind of exceed my expectations. Youngjae, I think, was relatively solid, but man, everything is just not working for KDF anymore. I don't even really know what kind of advice to give the org. I don't know what you do with some of these players. Like, Dudu and Bulldog are really interesting players, but you have to get a new bot lane, and I'm not sure if you want to keep Youngjae as well. It felt like a lot of the synergy ended up falling off on that pairing over the course of the next couple, or the last couple of weeks of the season. Whatever direction this KDF team goes in, it's really unfortunate how 2023 ended, and I think they're going to be kicking themselves for not at least being able to get into playoffs. And then for DRX on the other side, they are looking pretty likely to be able to get into that playoff spot. Obviously, we'll see in the next series if they are able to clinch it, but to even put themselves in this position after how miserable their mental must have been in the middle of the year is super admirable. A lot of these players, Fate and Krako, came back into the lineup after being benched and were much better after they came in. You've got to salute the resilience of some of these players, and they very well might have hit the jackpot here being able to hit that top 6. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the regular season, and one that will determine who ends up getting that number 6 seed, the final one in the playoffs. We had a matchup between KT Rolster and Liiv SANDBOX that KT is going to win 2-0, which secures DRX that 6th and final spot in the LCK playoffs. SANDBOX will not be getting it with this 2-0 loss, and I mean, to rub salt in the wound, as you can see up on the screen, not only did KT win 2-0, they played their starters only in Game 1. Their Challengers League team subbed in for Game number 2 and absolutely blasted SANDBOX, which just has to feel so garbage. Like, I can't imagine a world in which that feels good to end up going through, but how good does that feel if you are KT Rolster? I mean, holy hell, what a game coming in from these players in the Challengers League. That's probably the one that I'm going to focus on just a tad bit more because it's just so much more interesting. We know that KT is better than SANDBOX when they play their starters, but for their Challengers League team to come in and be as good as they were here, when really, honestly, they're like a mediocre team in the actual Challengers League, it's pretty insane. Now, obviously, they've got a ton of talent. You know, players like Humbach and Feisty and Hype have been on this KT team for a while, but Perfect, kind of a new addition, rank 1 solo queue player, somebody who's really highly touted more as an individual carry rather than like a team fighter. And Wei is somebody who's been really good in the Challengers League as well, and so really interesting to see them all get a little bit of like actual LCK time here against, you know, a team in Liiv SANDBOX that really isn't garbage. Like, they can at least kind of play the game, and they did really well. Feisty is actually going to be getting my player of the series here in the mid lane. Thought his game 2 on the Azir was really good and worth player of the series, in my opinion. I really wanted to give this to somebody on the Challengers League team because, you know, them being able to, body Liiv SANDBOX, I think is incredibly impressive. And certainly something I wanted to kind of, shout out and endorse in kind of a positive way, but I thought Feisty played really well. Hambach was really good in the jungle. Perfect, I think, showed that he is a solid laner, was able to go up against a player in clear that he has been able to go up against before and actually do really well. And Hype and Wei, I think, were more than solid in that game as well. Going up against Teddy and Kale, the community, has a hard on for Teddy, and so, seeing Hype and Wei just kind of destroy them in lane was pretty fun, just in general. But KT Rolster, I thought, was just super, super fun to watch here. It was really hard not to cheer for them in that game number 2 and in general. I think it's just kind of good for the league as a whole that they were able to come in and do as well as they did. But for SANDBOX, it's got to feel pretty bad that not only is your season ending here, but your playoff hopes were dashed by players who aren't even LCK players. That does not have to feel particularly good. There were some positives. I think Teddy did some good work on the Kai'Sa throughout this series, but, I honestly think he could have been a little bit more aggressive. I think this was one of his better series in a while in saying that, and so I'm not going to criticize him too hard. Closer had some moments on some champions that he's a lot more comfortable on, the Akali, the Yone, that fall in a little bit more into his skill tree, kind of that Zeka light, if you will. I think Willer wasn't really all that awful, but I think Kale just had a really rough split. I don't even really know how to describe it. This is a player that I'm so crazy high on, and that I've been crazy high on for quite a long time, and for him to be as bad as he was this split, it's almost unexplainable. I expect him to be able to bounce back, next year, and maybe a different environment. I don't know if it's a different team, or I don't know if it's just different teammates around him, but I don't expect him to play like this again. We've seen him in so many different environments play so well. To see him just completely fall off a cliff this year, it doesn't feel like that is entirely sustainable, but whatever the problem for SANDBOX was, I don't really know what the solution is, because this was just a really, really bad year for them. And now it's over. They are officially not going to be making the playoffs, which means that they are not going to be able to qualify for Worlds because they would have, at worst, the same amount of championship points as a team like DRX, and tie goes to Summer. It means that we already know our 6 teams, at the very least, that are going to be qualified for a chance to go to Worlds, and they're going to be the 6 playoff teams this split. So Sandbox has officially been eliminated from 2023, and that's definitely disappointing. I think a lot of people had high expectations for this team, maybe not going into the year, but certainly going into Summer after how well they performed in the spring split, and, you know, presumably upgrading their team by bringing Teddy into the bot lane, but it just didn't work out. This team got significantly worse as they went into Summer, and for whatever reason, that was just too much for them to be able to overcome. Hopefully some of these players end up finding landing spots where they can be a little bit better next year, because I do like some of the individual players on this team, but clearly as a unit, it just wasn't going to work out. But congratulations to KT. They have officially now locked the #1 seed. I think they did that before the series, but fun to see, you know, their Challengers League team do it. And, you know, I gotta say, this was probably one of the more fun series that I watched all year long, and a really great way to cap off a really interesting regular season. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK week number 9 overview and analysis video. Typically, I would say up on the screen are the standings and the power rankings and all that stuff, but it's only going to be the standings here this week because I've got an LCK playoff primer video dropping tomorrow or today, depending on how you want to view it here, as this video goes live. So I hope you guys are excited for that. We're going to go over all 6 of the playoff teams in depth. We're going to talk about the top 2 teams in general, just kind of talking about their advantages and disadvantages, and then previewing not only the first round matchups very in-depth, but doing a full bracket prediction and analysis. And of course, in that video is also going to be my regular season award picks, MVP, Rookie of the Split, and my 3 All-Pro teams. So definitely don't miss out on that one, but we gotta say goodbye to Sandbox, Bro, Nongshim, and KDF here today. Their season is done. They will be exiting. Some of them a lot more, you know, disappointed, I think, with this than others. Some of them, I think, expected it. But either way, we do know our top 6 teams, and I'm excited to see how exactly things shake out. Before we jump into the outro, time to go over my player of the week and my dud of the week. That I'm still going to do here for week number 9. My player of the week for week number 9 was actually a pretty easy choice, and it certainly is a surprising one to me. My player of the week in week 9 is going to go to Beryl, the support for DRX. They go 2-0. They clinched themselves a playoff spot, and Beryl was fantastic this week. He was super clutch in both of their series, really getting them across the finish line. I think without the performance from their support and, you know, Krako as an honorable mention here in the jungle, things would have been so much more difficult. I think another player I considered was KIA on T1, who had a really, really good week, again in a 2-0 week, but I think Beryl was a little bit more dominant in terms of what he was able to output. And then my dud of the week here in week number 9 is unfortunately going to go to Kale, the support for Liiv SANDBOX. The only player to get 2 dud of the weeks across this season, got one in week 4, is getting another one here in week 9. What a disastrous split for Kale. What a disastrous split for SANDBOX. They end up fumbling the bag. They do not make playoffs, and they've certainly got to be relatively upset by that. But, you know, I guess they're going to have to figure it out next year. It's going to be interesting to see the direction that org ends up going. But my week 9 dud of the week is Kale, and my week 9 player of the week is Beryl. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which of course I'm always very appreciative of. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only cover the LCK on this channel. We cover all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL, and playoffs are in all of them. Worlds is just around the corner if you want comprehensive analysis of all the teams that are going to be going to that World Championships. This is the place for that. Go ahead and hit subscribe, hit that bell, so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.